Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Verticals. I'm Luke Sofinos. I'm in the founder's seat. And as always, we're joined with Nick.
Excited to kick off today, Luke.
Awesome. So today we got Brian Litvack from LeagueApps. If you don't know LeagueApps, it powers a ton of youth sports businesses, camps, sports clubs, all of that. And so we're super excited to dig in with him. He's built a monster of a business, just had a big round done by Excel KKR. So we're going to talk with Brian a lot about really vertical software in a Hyper-SMB market, because youth sports is the perfect definition of Hyper-SMB. So looking forward to the conversation with him. But as always, before we bring on Brian, Nick and I are going to run through the vertical pulse today. So let's fire that up. Nick, sound good? All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. The first pulse we have for everybody is on this business called Ketrix. Ketrix raises a $39 million Series B to power the future of regulated artificial intelligence for life sciences. So I just wanted to call this out, Nick. I think it's interesting that I found the end market to be very interesting. So for those that don't know Viva is, a total staple in vertical software, one of the golden childs of vertical software. Ex-Salesforce guy raises a couple $1 million. I think they only raised $12 million to get all the way to IPO. And the whole focus was he's at Salesforce. He's seeing that, this life sciences sector is making up a huge part of their business, but Salesforce is really not tailored. This is early Salesforce tailored for this particular industry. And so he spins off, basically creates this company on top of Salesforce and their technology and makes a CRM dedicated to life sciences. Business continues to grow like wildfire, and just a really interesting end market. Obviously, a lot of dollars going into kind of life sciences across that whole ecosystem. But just thought this was really, really interesting because it highlights regulation as a moat, and I think that's really, really important in vertical AI. So, Nick, what do you think? Any comments? I know regulation is a strong moat, and you look for that in a lot of companies that you're backing these days.
Yeah, I think compliance is just a common wedge, or at least an attractive wedge that, we're seeing in AI native platforms. I think, everyone has to do it. It's not really a core competency of most businesses, or at least operating businesses. And, if you can solve those problems, you're usually cutting out, just dead weight loss time of whatever it is, filling out forms or submitting stuff to the right bodies. So look, life sciences is obviously heavily regulated, but you're also seeing it in a lot of categories of manufacturing, certainly across healthcare otherwise, CPG. It's just well suited to what LLMs do, which is, document processing, creation, and cutting out that time. So I think this is a super cool example of that. And yeah, it kind of follows a long history of some super interesting companies in life sci.
It will be interesting to see kind of if Viva responds or how they respond at all, if it makes sense for, if they come out with a competing module. We talked about that with a bridge and Epic. And so shall be interesting to see.
With that, let's jump into our next. So Augment has announced a pretty big raise, an $85 million, Series A. I forget the cadence of what they've actually raised in the past, but there's a couple interesting things here. I mean, one, just on the face of it, you can see the banner here. I don't know if you have to zoom in, but $110 million raised in 5 months, which, look, obviously it's impressive. I'm sure it speaks to, the quality of the team and maybe some of their early traction. So, kudos to them. I do think it's also an interesting, call it commentary on just where we are in kind of the cycle of venture that we're seeing these sort of rounds. Some people are kind of, pointing back to 21 and maybe it feels a little bit bubbly. But, on the other hand, look, some of these platforms, they feel like, hey, we got to raise a lot because vertical AI native companies are growing faster than ever. We got to own this category, et cetera. So, I mean, that I think just as a meta comment is super interesting. But the main reason I wanted to bring this up is, I think supply chain software tech in general has been in somewhat of a nadir the last couple of years, right? We had that kind of big boom from, call it 18 to 21. There were a couple of those Gen 1 companies, maybe, less capital light that struggled. And I think, funding pulled back. But now we are seeing, the opportunity to own AI, agentic platforms for shippers, carriers, brokers, freight forwarders, drayage, 3PLs, right? And it's a super exciting time. So we're maybe seeing that supply chain is back. I don't know. But certainly Augment is an interesting story. The other, which is Happy Robot, I think, that it's a bit of a different profile of company, albeit squarely in supply chain as well, right? This is a bit more of a traditional Series B, $44 million round raised by, the super smart folks over at Base 10. But I'd say from my perspective, Happy Robot, at least the way they talk about themselves, is a bit more grounded in a very discrete pain point, very discrete, kind of initial starting block for their product suite, which is, really around that communication and data sharing. So I thought it was just interesting to contrast these two, which, both announced over the last, week or so.
Yeah, I love supply chain as a vertical. I think it's there's a few reasons for that. One, it's massive. There's probably like a couple dozen sub verticals of supply chain that you could potentially focus on. So a lot of ways to kind of, expand across the value chain. And we've seen a lot of great companies, built out of it. Another Teal fellow, at Stored with Sean Henry, like they built a monster of a business relatively quickly. And so I love this vertical. I love this category. I'm a big believer that every single industry is going to have a dedicated AI agent platform that enables agents to really work in between all of the apps that are within that particular industry. And so I think we're just starting to see that. Like Triple Whale and e-commerce recently came out, both of these great examples. We talked about Elise and property management. I think this is where the tide is headed.
I think you make a really good point there, right? I think when a lot of people hear the phrase, every industry is going to have its agent or its agentic platform, it's really important to point out that when you look at categories like supply chain, like healthcare, to be honest, any kind of major top level, 3-digit NICE code sort of industry, the reality is that's probably 10 to 50 different sub industries based on how you look at it, right?
Alir taught us that last week.
Totally. I mean, that's a perfect example, right? Like the zeitgeist was restaurant technology is monolithic, right? He proved just one category within that was, a multi-$100 billion revenue business. Sorry, million. But the same is true, like healthcare. I mean, I would guess, I don't know, certainly 50 plus, if not 100 plus subsectors that could support billion-dollar businesses. I think supply chain is very much the same. And I think you could say the same in a lot of categories. So, when we're seeing every industry is going to have its agentic platform, and Luke, call me out if you disagree, that the net result is a lot of company and enterprise value creation, not, hey, we're going to have 6 that own the category.
No, I think that's right.
Awesome.
It's a little bit of a challenge in terms of, how many, when you're raising from VCs and you're going after a defined market, a lot of VCs obviously back into the TAM question. And I think VCs have gotten over that. Like that was very hard for me when I was raising, for my prior business, vertical SaaS for trade schools. I had to, this is like early Toast days and they couldn't really, most VCs couldn't figure out the TAM piece. And I think we're evolving. I think we're changing. And I think people are recognizing that, hey, even if you're going after a quote unquote sub vertical, the more product you create, the more you tap into actual services spend versus, traditional like per seat spend. These things can get big enough in most cases, or in a lot of cases.
Oh, 100%. If you can get that kind of dominant control point. I mean, I think Alir's example was, if you guys have seen that episode yet, Alir at Slice, he started out with, I think he said a $4,000 ACV and grew that up to almost 30 today, just by kind of knocking down categories. So, I think there is still that question of how do you get there, right? You can find a great wedge, but does that buy you a great control point for extensibility and TAM expansion? If you can, categories that may seem small can support huge businesses. And, maybe taking it back to supply chain for a second, these aren't the best known vertical software companies, but there are, I would guess high single digits public, software companies that are explicitly supply chain focused and that reach that public scale on, in some cases, not even 1,000 customers. So I think when you look at some of those businesses, right, Manhattan Associates, et cetera, that maybe aren't top of mind even for VCs, it's a good reminder of how big the opportunity is.
So this is a good segue because if I go back to this Augment post, what was it? Yeah, 110 million raised in 5 months. So, you had this article, Is Venture Broken? It feels, I don't want to sound the alarm because I was an unfortunate victim of the 2021, and victim is a strong word, but, raised at a crazy valuation, a multiple that took me 4+ years to grow into. It kind of feels like are we in that place right now? Are we close to it? What's your view of this? What's this article telling us?
Yeah, I mean, I can share my view, but I guess for listeners, so Beezer Clarkson, allocator, LP, longtime, commentator in the space, shared this post on LinkedIn a few days back, and the title of the question is venture broken? And really, what she's pointing out here is that mega funds have gotten pretty mega. They are, obviously composing most of kind of late stage rounds, but doing the math, she saw that mega funds were leading 30% of seeds, right? Which is pretty interesting because, you normally think about raising $1 billion plus fund. The majority of that capital is going to go late, but they're going earlier. Now, part of this also is that what is a seed round, right? Like when I started in venture, you had $1 million seed rounds. Seed rounds were common, right? Now, $10 million seed rounds are not uncommon. So there are some semantic questions here, but her overall point is, mega funds are going earlier. They're leading a lot of, kind of what we're calling seed rounds. And, at the same time, you're just seeing that concentration. And we just wrote an essay about this a couple of days ago entitled, We've Met the Enemy and He Is Us, because funds are driving this concentration. LPs are driving this concentration too. And that the net result are facts like this, facts like, half of dollars in, I think, year to date have gone to a single digit number of companies. 50% of LP dollars this year so far have gone into just 12 venture funds. And as a result, you get a lot of money in one place. That one place has to put the money to work. And so they start doing more rounds, bigger rounds, more expensive rounds, right? I think she, maybe just to kind of distill it, she posed really 3 questions at the end of this piece that I thought were insightful and maybe worth running through here. 1, are mega funds paying up to win the best founders or just the biggest deals, right? And I think this kind of ties in here, right? If you have a lot of capital put to work, you have to do bigger rounds and you have to find good companies you think can support that and will agree to raise that amount of money, right? So in some senses, are these rounds getting bigger and more expensive because the underlying assets are better or because the money has to be put in the ground? Second question, which Beezer posed that, I'd be interested to get your views on, Luke. Are boutiques or stage-focused funds, right? Basically everyone outside the platform funds, are they focusing on smaller rounds out of discipline, right? This is my model. I'm an X size funds. I've got to do these size deals. Or is it because of adverse selection, right? The big funds are offering huge amounts of money to quote unquote the best founders, and therefore all that's left for the smaller rounds are, maybe not the top tier founders. I think I have a view there, but Luke, I want to put that one to you first.
Yeah, so I think it's important that every founder actually goes through an exercise of doing the venture returns math for the particular fund that you're raising out of, right? So if you're going to a particular VC, you got to know the size of the fund. You need to understand like what the expectation is from their LPs and their investors, and know that that's what you're signing up for. I'm actually flabbergasted, and I used to be this way, so I understand it, but I'm flabbergasted the amount of founders that like don't understand the VC math, because you have to, again, you're raising out of these crazy monster funds. Like the expectation is that you're returning, the fund or at minimum, right? And now obviously it's power law, but that's the focus point. So, that's one side of the coin. There was a great piece. We'll have to share it in the comments, but there was a great piece on fund math that was put out by an LA firm a few years ago. I'm blanking on who it was, but it was incredible because it kind of broke down exactly like, hey, you you hit a double, like you feel like you crushed it. It's life-changing money for the founder. They're walking, they sold for a couple $100 million, but in reality, it moved the needle like 5% for the fund, right? So it's just important that you do that math is point one. Point two is people don't like to talk about it, but I think a lot of VCs just play AUM games, right? Because, just like a founder likes to say, oh, I raised a bunch of money, like, the VC likes to say that they have a bunch of assets under management, and you back into their management fees at 20% over 10 years, right? The 2 and 20, like, yeah. And so if you could raise $1 billion fund, that's $200 million in management fees. It's $20 million a year. It's insane. So obviously, like, it's hard for people to say no to more and more capital, but like, how many companies can actually support $100 billion to $1 trillion outcome? And that's why all the capital just goes into like the very few companies right now. It's all the LLM companies that could actually support something like that.
Yep. I think those are all good points. And I think that article you may have been remembering could have been Mark Schuster's at Upfront.
That's right.
That's right. Had to be, God, at least a decade ago. But yeah, I mean, look, I think I would agree with all that. And just, for the founders in the room, it is worth thinking about, hey, how does the venture business model work? Because every investor has to underwrite your business to some sort of outcome that's going to have an impact on returns, right? And if they want to invest $100 million into your company, I don't know, 20, 30% of the company, maybe less if it's a later stage, they're going to need to see a multi-billion-dollar exit, certainly. And chances are they may be trying to go for something bigger, right? And so does that align with what your vision for the company is? The other consideration is dilution. If mega funds are going earlier, but they still want to put a lot of money to work, well, they're probably going to look for higher ownership opportunities, right? And higher ownership usually means, have more dilution for the founder. And so I think it's always important to remember that if your company continues to be successful, and as we're saying right now, there are frequently ups and downs. There's nothing wrong with a flat round or an occasional down round, but to keep it simple, let's imagine it's a typical seed ABC growth, et cetera story. This raise is going to be the lowest valuation you ever raise at, and hence the most dilutive. So does it make sense to maximize capital in? Probably not, is the reality. There's a reason why the stage terminologies exist, even though they change every year. And different funds are specialists at different stages. So maybe, think about finding a partner who is going to be the right incentive alignment, the right, kind of level of dilution and runway for your business, and also just the right partner who can move the needle on your business, or at least hopefully accelerate you at that stage, right? Doing a pre-seed with a fund that really honestly cares about writing the $50 million checks probably doesn't make sense. In the same way that, at least today, I'm not investing in pre-IPO companies, right? So I wanted to bring this one up as well, Luke, because, it's a great compliment to Beezer's piece. So, Tamaz, longtime Redpoint investor, now running, his new firm, Theory Ventures, focused on AI, has been writing great content for a very long time. So I'm sure all our listeners are familiar. In this piece, he really documents how, seed rounds overall are growing in terms of both, number and size, but we're seeing sub $5 million seeds, which frankly, most seeds historically were thought of, as kind of a couple million. We're seeing those shrinking, right? And there's probably some element of this that's, semantics. What do you call a seed? What do you call a pre-seed, et cetera? But, I think back to, Beezer's point around the growth of mega funds and having all that capital to deploy, you're just seeing rounds get bigger as people want to deploy more dollars. And of course, when there's more supply, it makes sense that founders might capitalize on that. So, he shares some great data here that folks should check out. But, I think the real question from the founder perspective might be, what is the right partner for me? And, do they suggest a certain raise size because they want to deploy more capital, or because they think it's actually best for my business that I raise more capital? So everyone should check out this piece as well.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I can't really, I just saw that graphic really quickly. It was saying that the 2020 companies going into Series A are smaller by a significant percentage. What was the percentage? They're 20% smaller at Series A today than they were in 2020. So it's like when you get that much capital, I mean, we should ask Brian this, but like if you get that much capital on, that early in your journey, like it's not necessarily a good thing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it can be a negative, and frankly, it's just not always necessary, right? No one wants to be fundraising. Frankly, whether you're a founder or a GP, no one wants to be fundraising over and over and over again. But got to do what's right for your business. And I think there are certainly other factors at play here, including the fact that VC funds in this era of AI are worried that, hey, some of these companies are growing so fast and so capital efficient. If I don't come in now, I'm never going to get in, right? And I think especially when you look at that at scale seed Series A, that often that's when these companies are starting to get profitable, right? Even if they're not loading up the balance sheet, they have more optionality around what and when to raise. And so I think, my personal theory is you may see more companies raising $1 million, $2 million, $3 million off the bat, and then not really need to go back out to market until maybe growth or maybe Series A, but they don't need to continually raise. And that really changes the, profile and trajectory of capital raising in general. So that's something that as an investor, the venture ecosystem is going to have to respond to.
All right. Well, that's our vertical market pulse. Let's get our Titan on the line here. I think Brian's knocking up the door. All right. We got Brian Litvack here. He's our vertical Titan of the week. Brian's a good friend. Super excited he's here. Thanks for being here, man. Brian has built a killer business called LeagueApps. We're super excited to jam out with him, pick his brain on what's worked, what hasn't worked. The business is really end-to-end vertical software for youth sports. And it's what a lot of VCs would call Hyper-SMB. And so we're excited to dig in today on what's worked for Brian and the team and what hasn't, and how they've built a big business over a decade plus run here. And we'll talk about a big round that they just did recently as well. So welcome to the pod, Brian.
Thank you for having me, Luke. Good to connect here, Nick. Excited to be on. Can jam on vertical SaaS for as long as people will listen to me. And Luke is one of the few who will listen for long amounts of time. So let's have some fun.
Awesome. I love it. Well, maybe Brian, if we can, I'd love to just start with kind of the founding story and how you started LeagueApps, what it was like in the early days, maybe, initial product, initial go-to-market. Let's start there.
Sure. So this goes all the way back to 2007. We actually started a consumer business called SportsVite, like Evite for sports, that was to help adults find other people to play sports with in their communities. And while it was a fun business and a good story to tell, there wasn't a great business model, and building consumer is hard. And what we learned along that journey is that there are people out there who are super passionate about making sports happen within their communities, and they have very little resource or knowledge or software to help them do so. So these sports operators, starting at adult and then we quickly moved into youth, we wanted to build them the tools that they needed to help make sports happen. And the joke I like to say that nobody laughs at, but if you're listening to a vertical SaaS podcast, you might, is that we thought we were building a company to help make sports happen in communities. And what we've come to find out, we've built a vertical SaaS payments-enabled fintech software platform with consumption pricing and high retention. And that turns out to be a good way to scale a business. So I think the punchline of the joke is we are very much, and I truly believe, a youth sports business with a mission to create amazing sports experiences for all. And software, data, now AI is just one of the ways that we can have impact versus lining fields or being in any single community. And it also allows you to have more impact because you can scale and you can grow and you can work with more communities more quickly than I think any other way really that you can do that in youth sports today.
Awesome. And what was the, one of the challenges with youth sports from like the investor perspective, and Nick, weigh in on this, but it's super fragmented, right? You got a ton of really small clubs, it's parents, it's what we call Hyper-SMB. Like, how did you think about that in the early days? Was the product free initially? What was the first product?
Well, the market's shifting quite a bit over the last decade or so, but the way I would characterize youth sports market, and when we focus on team sports, mostly in the U.S., is there's about 150,000 organizations across those 8 or 9 major team sports for things like tournaments and leagues and camps and club teams. And traditionally in past generations, there was a nonprofit club in your community and they ran sports and, maybe 1 or 2 of them. But what has happened in the last few generations is there's now multiple types of sports organizations in your community. A lot more of them are for profit. A lot tie into field space or facilities. They're more specialized by sport. So a basketball AAU program will be different than a lacrosse organization. That will be different than your, traditional Little League. So most of them are between, at least our market is between a few $100,000 in revenue and a few $1 million in revenue. There's more and more larger organizations today. And then there's always this long tail of, one league or one camp. And it's becoming more professionalized. Parents are willing to spend on their kids' youth sports experiences. So more and more of the market is going towards more business, commercial, professionalism in the experiences that these organizations provide families. So it's almost like this aspect of youth sports development or youth enrichment that sports is falling into versus just like, this thing you sign your kids up for when they're 6 years old and, because everybody else does it. So we've seen that evolution and we continue to see the evolution. There's some interesting things happening on the operator side. Up until recently, I would say to your point of Hyper-SMB, anyone who organized a sports league didn't do it because they thought they were getting rich or because, they got into the business by their, uncle or something, which happens in some other SMB verticals. They're usually super passionate, very philanthropic, and they believe they're providing value to their communities, like to have influence, whether that's helping kids get into college or make the team or even just knowing the, municipal leaders in their community, and a big dose of entrepreneurial grit because the workflows of putting all these events on in real time throughout the community, it's almost like a concert promoter or venue where all over the neighborhood you're dealing with live events with weather and permits and conflicts. So, super gritty, very passionate customer base. We call them partners because we truly believe we want to be their partners to make sports happen. That traditionally wasn't getting into it because they loved logistics or softwares or majored in this in college.
Brian, just help us understand for listeners who maybe aren't as familiar, like who exactly are these? Like, are these folks who are doing this professionally on the side, coaches, schools, like?
Yeah, so that's shifted a lot. In the past, there was a lot of volunteers. People would dedicate their free time to helping make sports happen in their community. And what you would see is, if you wanted to go into coaching, you would be a teacher and coach a high school team. More and more, it is becoming a profession where people's full-time jobs are running a sports club or a sports organization are tied to a facility. So they're looking at this more as just this thing I am passionate about is also my livelihood. Now, this is a burgeoning or emerging space. So there's not much career development. There's not much certification or expertise. But there is a lot of passion in it. And we believe youth sports in the U.S. is a $75 billion market. So there's a lot of money being spent. So that there is a lot of opportunity out here. And oftentimes the ones that are most successful kind of marry that. They run a great program, but they're also very entrepreneurial, very enterprising, are figuring out how to make field space work, how to get into communities, how to offer different types of programming, how to get into more sports or more program types. It's amazing sometimes to see what a sports operator can do and how they split up a field or how many camps they run on a random Tuesday during the week when there's parent-teacher conference and no school. They're on top of like all this very kind of hyper-local activity in their community to make sure that their organizations are providing both, value to their community and also helping, grow and expand on, their own goals or initiatives.
Brian, take us back to the beginning where you pivot out of the consumer piece and you decide you're going to do B2B. Like, who are the first customers? What's the initial product?
Yeah, so no such thing as vertical SaaS in 2010, right? And we couldn't raise any type, we couldn't sniff a real round until for 5 or 6 years because The qualifying question when we meet an investor is, do you have kids who play sports between 5 and 17? If they say yes, you could have a good conversation. If they said no, it was like, we used to give out sweatbands like that. It's a LeagueApp fund, and we like give them a sweatband and basically walk out and recognize there's no chance. Even if they did have kids that play sports, they said a no. And for all those trying to raise money, sometimes it takes 6 years and, hundreds of meetings before you really figure it out. But what we saw in our initial platform, which was SportsFight, was the super users, the people who cared the most, that were going on the message boards, that were promoting their events, were these sports operators or sports organizers. And in many cases, because we had good SEO, their SportsFight profile was ranking ahead of their websites. And we had a place where they could put their website in, and you would click on their website, and it was just, very basic, and didn't have online registration, and didn't have scheduling, and didn't have any of the communication tools that are essential to running this. So it became apparent that if we can build the tools for these sports operators in the community, now we would only have to get the 10 or 12 people in that community who make sports happen, instead of trying to get hundreds or thousands of participants. And again, this was adult, and then we moved into youth. So we recognized we had the same mission. We want to create amazing sports experiences, but we said the way to do it would be the tools for the operators who then can create better sports experiences in their communities. And that's how we'd reach the
So the first product was websites?
The first product is actually very similar to what we had. We started in saying, you know what, we got to build a full suite. We need to build registration that ties into payment, because their whole business models are based on pay to play, which you might hear in youth sports, but it's to sign their children up to participate. It comes with a fee. And then it was making teams, creating schedules, and building websites. And those are, similar to many other vertical SaaS tools, right? It's like, those are the basic kind of workflow automations and ways that data is flowing around. And really what has happened is 2010 still happens now. The organization creates a registration and a payment model. You sign up. Once you sign up, that registration gets appointed to a team. Once the teams are formed and the schedules are created, then the messaging tool for email, push notifications, text messages of alerts of schedule changes, or different requirements for parents, or information about what's happening for that local event. We have a bunch of reporting tools, whether it ties into accounting or business intelligence now. And then websites and mobile apps are the way that the parents interact with the platform. So it is all one kind of long workflow that we're just trying to figure out all the different ways that different types of sports programs needed to work to help them automate, save time, and make it really easier to do what they love to do, which is often be at the field coaching kids, creating great experiences, not in, staying up till 3 a.m, doing logistical
on spreadsheets. Yeah. So you didn't charge for that product initially, right? Like, one of the things I think we've talked about in the past is you kind of nailed the business model out of the gates, which was, I'm just going to monetize on the transaction. Is that right?
There was a company called Active Network. It's still around. They were doing endurance and like races, and they had acquired a bunch of really small platforms. Again, this is like early 2000s, so before vertical SaaS. And they had a model where you just took the money on the payments. And that worked well because a lot of seasonal businesses, they're only collecting revenue in certain months. And then the second aspect of this was they didn't have billing departments. They didn't have ways to procure software. So we said, pay as you go. You could pass it along to your customers, or you could eat it yourself. We'll at the end of each month calculate the amount of fees for transactions, and we'll take a little percentage. And that's our business model as a way to make it as easy as possible to get them to switch to our software. And a big turning point was, I think, probably 18 months in, maybe later in 2011, early 2012, we came up with this idea of selling a launch package. It was $100 or $500 at the time. And the launch package was what got the commitment. So we would, getting a deal was closing a launch package. We've gone through different ways of estimating how much revenue we think it would generate from payments. But that helped us build process against the go-to-market cycle, because before that, we would just almost try to onboard them. And then the day before their registration would start, they would tell us, oh, we're not going to do this, or get cold feet. So getting that commitment, even though it was a nominal amount, for a launch package became a really integral part of the process for us to kind of grow and scale our new acquisition.
And when you say launch package, is that for them launching new businesses, new leagues, new seasons?
Oh, no. It was as simple as saying, once you pay your launch package, we'll give you 2 or 3 onboarding calls and we'll help set you up. But once they paid their launch package, they were on our side of let's get this live where we made a commitment. And one of the things I think you see with Hyper-SMB is like their word is important. The commitment is important. It's not around paperwork and it's not selling to a mid-market corporate executive who has to get this cleared by legal or compliance. It's very much getting someone to commit is the key step. And whether that's a $500 check or whether that's signing their name against something or some other way, that's often the kind of key point to consummating a relationship or partnership.
Was that initial product, it sounds like maybe it was initially geared around time savings, but was part of that, hey, you want to be an entrepreneur and have this maybe be full time, we're going to help you be more consistent, make more revenue, of course, give a better experience.
The wedge was collecting payment. Before you would have to collect payment by having like registration nights at, where parents would come with checks or cash, a lot of
pizza
cash.
Parties.
Yeah. A lot of cash was getting lost or misplaced in youth sports in the 90s and early 2000s, right? And, being able to say, we can make this more convenient for you to fill out the registration and submit the payment online was one of the most, friction-filled, time-consuming steps to organizing sport. So that was the way we could both monetize, but one of the most important aspects of what a sports organization or operator would need.
Is that like, I guess zooming back to the really early days, right? Super fragmented market. As you said, maybe back then even less kind of professional or full-time, probably folks who have a lot on their plates. Like, how did you get that initial spark of momentum? Like, was there any kind of a distribution hack?
I think the first recognition is you're not buying your leads on ZoomInfo or whatever the platforms are. Like, we would have to go out and do different really manual research projects to figure out how and where to find the contact information for sports operators. And that became as big a part as our go-to-market and demand gen as any specific tactic was just getting the data of who are the 47 people on Long Island who run lacrosse programs, right? And we've done everything from, it was in the early days, it was a big part of our account executives and SDRs to building big offshore teams to, running scrapers and trying to do almost like statistical analysis. How many counties are there in the US? How many people in any county? How many sports organizations do we expect? How do we then go find if, the sports organizations? There's also a lot of turnover, so you need to update that information. In the last year, we're using more and more AI, and some of the tools are pretty incredible because of how efficient they are in helping you get the contact information of organizations and the people in those organizations. So that was a big recognition of. Now, look, we always took pride in that. If you could buy the leads on a database, so can everybody else. If you're really good at figuring out how to get them, then that's a differentiator. And for most of, our business was 10,000 calls a month, and we had our conversion rates of how many calls go to scheduled demos, how many scheduled demos turn into actual demos. The demo has always been the key point. If we can get someone, a demo isn't that big of a deal in other areas where someone's sitting in front of their desk all day long and their job is to do demos. But for us, we could get them on a demo that showed a lot of intent and a lot of conviction that they were interested because they're, getting on a screen share for 45 minutes when they don't have necessarily a desk job. And then once we closed, from demo to close and then from close to launch, that's been our funnel. That still is, basically our funnel. And it's been interesting every time over the last decade where we've tried to get, more sophisticated or feel like, where things are moving away from some of those tried and true principles. we learned the hard way. No. Let's just kind of stick with our basics. This process works. It's much more tweaking and incrementalism than trying to figure out, is there an incredibly new demand gen strategy, or is there a distribution that we could get? Because, when you're doing this, it is week to week, day to day output and performance. I look at the numbers at the end of every day and know, is this going to work this week or this month? And if you're too busy planning your next quarter or planning some big strategy, you're going to miss the day or the week or the month. And that's just the pace that you have to go at, I believe, in SMB on the GTM side.
So for GTM, was it founder-led sales? Like it's you and the initial crew doing these kind of market research projects, and then ideally finding numbers, cold calling. And then at some point you figure out, okay, as long as we do the upfront work on identifying these people, now we can actually hire, kind of inside sales reps or inside BDRs, SDRs to really drum this up. And could you see the economics working like early, or did it take years?
So again, we're bringing this back like 15 years ago, right? That first year, I didn't really understand inside sales. I'd never done it before. There was a company called Single Platform in New York that a lot of great people came out of that company. And I went to their office and it was just vibrant and people jumping around, and they had all kinds of contests and games and making calls. And I said, oh, this is exactly what we need to do. And it just opened my eyes. I went back to that office probably 2 or 3 times. Wiley Cirilli was the CEO and this guy, Adam Liebman, was the head of sales. And they were very open of just sharing everything. And I said, we're selling to sports operators, a lot of athletes. Let's just have a lot more fun with this. And that's what we turned it into. Like, this every week, all kinds of contests. You do a demo and you shoot a Nerf ball and you can win $10, right? And stuff like that. And we got good at the metrics. And what we saw early on was, and this goes to like the ACV, that if we could get these organizations on our platform, the lock-in and retention, especially because we have payments, is well beyond what most traditional SMB SaaS tools were, right? We're looking at, 95% plus gross retention.
So I want to drill in here because this is super important. Like your retention is very atypical for the segment that you're serving, right? And it's incredible. Like it's super powerful. Why is it? Is it just some sort of kind of camaraderie that they're feeling? Like you guys really care about the community? Like how are you doing it?
And I think this is a misnomer, because I think a lot of vertical SaaS businesses in the right markets, Luke, I would love to talk about your company, right? But like have pretty good retention. And we were doing payments and registration and had all the data of a sports organization. If you do that right, they do not want to leave. This isn't like, well, our budgets are changing. They're running their whole organization, where their operating system, and they're on, LeagueApps 7, 8, 9 hours a day. So it was interesting because a lot of our partners or customers today, they complain about a lot of things. Why isn't that button there? Why can't we bulk move? Like, because they're in our system, for a better part of their week, right? So we think we have a lot of lock-in. We want to be partners with sports communities forever. I bristle every time we have a churn, because it's like we did something not awesome with our product or service, because otherwise they should be on our platform forever. So I think that's much more of the nature of the software tool that you have and the way you're providing value. And we always prided ourselves on being the integral partner, the system of record of these sports organizations.
I think you're totally right, Brian. At least in the VC world, I mean, it's a bit of a lazy view, but I think sometimes when some VCs hear about, low ACV, highly fragmented markets, SMB, SaaS, or AI, say, well, churn's going to be tough, right? And I don't think that's right on the face of it. I mean, certainly there's some selection bias, because I think especially in lower ACV solutions, the business can't really grow without any sort of significant churn. But in some ways, that forces you to figure it out early. For you guys, were you largely replacing like an active network, or for the most part, this was kind of their first business operating system?
It's funny, because in the early days, it was like, they don't want to switch this from the sales team. The sales team, if they don't close every deal, they're going to gripe. So in the early days, all the griping was they don't want to switch. They don't see the value of this. And now it's like, well, they already like their platform too much, right? So over the last decade, it's a lot more of getting them on their first platform to getting them off their legacy first platform with a lot more. So we have a lot more integrations into, how to automate your accounting or your business intelligence. So now where it's much more, they're almost all doing some form of online registration or payment. And it's really about giving them even more tools and more sophistication. In the early days, it was often the first time they were figuring out how to either do online payments or how to do something beyond PayPal where they would need to charge for, different sessions or different payment plans or different like days of the week for camp. So, different, depending on the maturity of the market, you kind of have different value propositions or different ways to provide the right solutions. And I think that's, where AI is coming in now is I want to be employees. So a lot of sports organizations, let's say $1 million organization, which is pretty sizable. They have thousands of kids playing. They'll often have 2 or 3 full-time employees and then large part-time staffs of coaches, admins, refs, and which again, it's hard to manage. You have 75 1099s. But what I'm saying these days is this is our chance. How are we employees 3, 4, and 5 of that sports organization? Because we're giving them all the reporting and we're doing more of the insights and analysis, and we're telling them how they can allocate their field space, and we're helping them send out those messages. So it's like an opportunity for us to be even more valuable to how they run their organization than we were before, where we able to do a lot of workflows, but they still had to do most of the heavy lifting and the thinking and the work within it. And then just doubling back, look, here's the other part of high retention is you got to work hard at sales because people don't want to switch. And even if their platforms aren't all that, awesome or feature rich or modern, they don't like to switch. So it is a big benefit on the CS side, that kind of natural baked in stickiness. But it means you always got to go hard on the sales side, on the new logo acquisition side.
Is that how the product has evolved? Is you started with that kind of one, traditional youth sports workflow that we talk through, right? Which is registration, payments, schedule. You've really evolved now into, as the market's evolved into, now they've got some full-time people, right? They're more professional. Do you evolve the product into like payroll and paying all the, the part-time people and the refs and all these things? Is that kind of how it's evolved?
We just went from 2010 to 2025 pretty quickly.
We did.
But you know what I see? Like the whole embeddable finance thing, because we're starting to, we think our business and our space has good components where that can be valuable. But there's a lot more hype than I see of real great examples and use cases of where some of those things with issuing, lending, budgeting, bill pay, are actually that valuable. So and I'm looking, I'll listen to your podcast more. I crave those examples because it really, to me, is very specific to the vertical in the market, right? Lending is one where it seems like in some SMBs that are just dying to get cash flow to keep their business flowing is essential. In youth sports, it's just not that essential. In once in a while, they might manage their cash wrong, but the demand is there. They usually get their cash before the programs are being run. And lending, we're gonna experiment with it. We're about to, but it is not the main value proposition of the things that we can do. So we're trying to figure out those in different categories and where that can be most valuable. I think what we've done, like one of the innovations we've had is we built a really robust analytics platform. We use a company called Sigma, a plug for them. They do a nice job, and it was fully white labeled embedded. I remember Luke coming to you and saying, "Hey, we want to give sports operators the same analytics of if you had your own Tableau database, or a data analyst." And we've been able to build out a really strong suite of tools for things like cart abandonment and retention and churn and lifetime value. Now, some sports operators don't fully understand what all that means, and we figured out how to put some thought leadership against it. But that's an area where we want to help provide insights into these operators of, should you be running more programs? Which should you be charging? How should you think about, how to achieve your goals by using data, not just, hunches and weather, from last season. So, I think we are believers that if these sports operators can get out of the grind of being all over the community on the field and have a little bit more time to plan their business, that can provide better sports experiences. So how can we be their business partner? I get most excited to be like their business partner, business consultant of esports, right? And that, I want to build cool coaching AI tools, and I want to build everything, right? But I think where we can constantly see that we can be most valuable is being their business organization partner.
Mm-hmm.
Got it. Go ahead, Nick. Sorry,
just one quick question, because I think it gets really at the crux of, the underlying topic here today of kind of hyper fragmented, hyper SMB markets. Maybe, Brian, could you tell us, what did that kind of LTV CAC math, or at least like ACV, look like in the early days, and how is that involved? If there are numbers you could share.
Yeah. So what has changed in the market is, when we first started this, we thought, we're going to get 30,000 organizations and they'll each pay us a few $1,000s. That's kind of how like MindBody's numbers have worked. They were always a company that, pretty early on were as a good comp. What has happened is there's a lot more multi-million-dollar youth sports organizations. So we're spending a lot more time focusing on the top 20,000 of those 150,000 than on the long tail. And they've, especially coming out of things like COVID, they've done well in expanding their programming, evolving to what parents or communities and the next generation want. So our ACV has crept up pretty considerably, where now it's over 10K on just the payments. But what I would say, one thing on those early days is I was very unsure of how we could have BDRs if our ACV was 2 or 3K, because everyone said you can't, right? And it has to be full cycle sales reps. And that was the kind of the math wouldn't work, right? And one, we did have better retention, but I also saw that so much of the challenge was getting to the demo, and that getting to the demo is a full-time job. And then we have a full product where you're the operating system. So being really knowledgeable about the software was also important. And that was a full-time job. So we've always split it as BDRs, SDRs were trying to get to the demo and get that appointment scheduled. And then our account executives were really taking it from there, even when we were a small ACV. And every time we've tried to say, okay, now we got to go back to, a full cycle sales reps, it's almost overwhelming. Whether that's a 3K ACV or a 30K ACV, we've kind of continuously seen the ability to split up the people who can drive demand and be the appointment setters. And there's a lot of skill to that. And many times over the years, I said, I got to get back to sitting with the BDRs and getting this down, because they're about to hang up the phone. And if we can get them engaged, and oftentimes getting them engaged is talking about their passion for sport or their minor league career or what's happening with their tournament, because it's really hard to help, explain all the features to them, but they know they have a pain point in this area. And then our account executives, we get on the demo and we do a really professional job of showing them all the ways that there could be value. So we've always had a pretty clear split between BDRs and AEs, where I think a lot of the conventional wisdom or blog posts that you would read would say that that math is hard to work out. Like, we also used to say, well, in our early sales decks, when we would have that retention, our LTV is 25 years, and people would laugh at us and go, well, if you calculate it, that's what the LTV is, right? So I think again, in vertical SaaS, it's like really know your market deeply, because a lot of the math, it's not the math that gets applied across SaaS. It's the math that gets applied in your market.
And were you underwater with that, having both of those kind of roles with those types of ACV? I mean, it sounds like you guys didn't raise money for the first 5 or so years. So were you always kind of break even?
We would raise like $1 million from friends and family at a time. So we were always, but it was like very efficient up until the first 6 years. We probably raised $3 million. Then I think we hit like 12 million ARR right going into COVID, and then our revenue went down 96% in April because it was all payments, and that's a whole nother podcast, right? But I think to get to that, we had raised $20 million over the first 10 years to get to 12 million in ARR going into COVID, and then
That's fantastic.
and then coming out. But so it was always somewhat efficient. You know, BDRs and AEs, we were back then. It was like very minimal base salary. You know, I had never worked in like a traditional sales thing, so I always liked to give more base, like 70% base first commission or 80% base first commission, and like the 50-50, you know, we've evolved a little bit over the years, and, you know, but, you know, I tell all the time, I'm like, we're on sales playbook, like version 50, right? Like this thing constantly gets tweaked, and we ripped up a lot of what we did in the last 9 months with some more AI tools. We've gone from 12 BDRs down to 5 because we have so much AI tooling and automation and process now that has helped us be super efficient. Some of the progressive dialers, you know, some of the what I was saying before on the lead generation tools are just really impressive in how efficient they can make your team.
So you scale up to double digit ARR, kind of 2020. It all vanishes. You and I have had like dinners and Zooms and lunches talking about that time, and that is a whole other podcast. But like you pull off kind of miraculous survival, right? Probably in a really dark time, being really a transaction focused business. Coming out of that, what has growth looked like, and have you guys had a really big focus on like adding more traditional SaaS revenue with like some of these analytics products, or how are you thinking about that now?
Yeah, so one of the interesting serendipities of COVID was since we had a pricing model that was all based on payments, even though our revenue kind of went to nothing, we were able to really rally behind our partners and youth sports. And my co-founder partner, Jeremy, did a great job of he was basically on webinars every day. These sports operators had no clue what was going on. They had no clue of the rules. They didn't know if they were going to get arrested or like what was going to happen if they were allowed to use fields. And we just leaned heavily into this concept of return to play, and you know, all kinds of webinars and just outreach and support resources and articles. And, you know, we had one of our sales reps was like, I don't think this is leading to deals. And I got on it was with a bunch of women lacrosse teams. And it was like 5 or 6 women were crying about like the things and the ordeals they were going through. And after the call, he's like, you see, I told you I can't get any deals. They're crying on the call. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure that this is going to help, you know, our business and our brand. And coming out of COVID, the first organizations it was really neat because a lot of people are questioning what they do in COVID. And by July, the idea of returning to play, getting kids out on the field, had nothing to do with politics, just what everyone was desperate for it. This idea of sports-based, or youth-based social, SBYD, sports-based youth development became like a real concept. And in many cases, sports came before schools. But the sports that came before schools were offering the most enterprising ones who knew how to get around some of the regulations, who figured out how to get field spaces, who figured out how to use masks, who figured out how to do Zoom coaching sessions. And it really took off, especially some of the economic factors, I think also with disposable income, club sports and the more for-profit enterprise sports organizations came out of 21 on fire. And our businesses and our numbers and everything, it was so hard to do the metrics because you couldn't, just all the metrics were thrown out. You couldn't show growth. You didn't know what your average deals was. So we were just looking at like, you know, early 21 or late 20 and early 21 and just seeing and having no idea what our volume and our transaction activity would be each month. And it just, you know, for 10 or 11 months, which is like way more than we had expected. And I think since then, what we've seen is just this like drive towards much more of a professional industry. We've been saying we know how much we process. We know we know what percent of the market we have. So we've been saying forever, this is a $75 billion market. And it used to be like, people thought it was a $5 billion market. Then they would say it's a Times article came out that is a $15 billion market. Now everyone uses 45 billion, right? And you realize there's no research reports, there's no Gartner,
nobody knows. You know better than anybody else.
Yeah, and the thing that's weird is like people kind of think that it must be out there and it must be correct, and nobody knows. You know the best your market, right? So they peg these numbers on your market and they say, oh, that's a $20 billion market. I'm sure there's Luke, some of the stuff with trade schools. It's like you, and that's I think a big inherent advantage. Like the market, what's happening in the market. We're at a point now where we're saying we have millions and millions of registrations. We process billions of dollars a year. We have thousands and thousands of organizations, and we know how much spend there is. And for every dollar spent on registration, $4 or $5 are being spent in other areas. And we're breaking down the share of wallet for a sports operator. We're breaking down the share of wallet for a parent. And we're trying to figure out where are other places we can bring efficiency. We could use our data. We could be valuable. We could provide solutions in the market. And it's still a place where our data is just so much richer and better and more accurate than anything else that you'll find anywhere.
So Brian, if you were starting over and someone gave you $10 million off the bat, would you have done it differently? And do you think you would have had a different growth profile, or would you even take it?
Yeah, my initial reaction is we would have screwed up, because this is a market where you can't put all the money into marketing. You can't go faster. Our biggest struggle is coming out of COVID. We raised the big round and hired all these experts, and it didn't drive the growth as much as we would have hoped. And it's you have to build the right, I've always said you have to build the right product. You have to have the right go-to-market. You have to have the right account management post-sale process. You have the right finance. You have the right metrics. They all go together. I don't think you could jump so far ahead in product or so far ahead in go-to-market. It maybe in some markets, but I always thought you had to grow the whole thing at the same time. And, it's a lot. I often think in these what you guys are saying, Hyper-SMBs, it's a lot of passion, a lot of understanding your customer. I would never tell any sports operator I'm a vertical SaaS guy, right? It would laugh at you, right? So I'm a youth sports person. I believe I'm a sports operator too. I just, I'm not as good a coach as you and don't know how to, be on the field. So I work on software as the way to do it. And I think you got to fully appreciate, understand your market. And if anything, the biggest shortcut is building the best product in the market that super serves the needs of those operators. And if you do that well, and you really understand your market, I think you'll figure out the go-to-market mode.
Nick, Brian and I can't remember. I think we had lunch in Miami, or we did a Zoom kind of coming out of ZERP. We were looking back, it was 23, I want to say, or maybe 24. And we were looking back on what had happened 21 and 22. And we were both kind of kicking ourselves and laughing at ourselves to a certain degree. And Brad, I don't want to speak for you, but I had this example where I raised a massive Series B, January 2021, hire a shitload of people, way more people than, I had any business doing. And I end up doing a riff from 100-ish employees to back down to 40 or 50. And we grew the same amount with half the people. And I think Brian had a similar story. And we're this whole notion of crazy amounts of capital being available in some vertical SaaS businesses, it's literally a curse. It's going to F up your business.
Yeah, I think you're going to grow with operational rigor, continuing to figure out how to solve the needs of these SMBs. It's interesting. SMBs, they don't care about fancy or flash. It's so different than horizontal SaaS. And I'm always very not skeptical, but discerning of the horizontal SaaS salesperson. It's just so different. They're going to the same conferences. They're selling software, we buy all the sales enablement tools and all the marketing automation. But then I'm looking, they're selling to each other. They're all going to the same events. They're all on the same page. And it's just so different, because there you're buying the sexy new product, or you're doing the thing that everyone wants to do, or you're implementing the new AI tool. SMB, they don't have any conception of that, right? They're just saying, can you solve my problem? And how much do I believe you that you can solve my problem? And okay, I guess software is the way that you'll solve it, right? But very few of them, it's changing, but very few of them are like excited to learn about the software. They just are excited to solve their problem. And I think that goes across all of SMB when it comes to software.
I've always thought about that question around, does a $10 million seed make sense? 5, 1, like in the early days, of course you're in search of solutions, but you're also in search of challenges for your business. And when you have unlimited capital and you can throw people at any problem, you don't really develop a great understanding of where your real rate limiting factors or bottlenecks are. So totally agree with you guys there. I mean, Luke, maybe we should kind of get towards some of our core final questions here. And I had one I can start with here, which is, I think in this kind of current era of AI, you hear a couple of common narratives, around SMB software or vertical SMB software. One is that, hey, is that kind of SMB business owner, that sports league manager, you don't have a whole lot of time. AI can maybe do a lot more for you, give you a better one-stop shop. And so it's basically a tailwind, right? Another is, well, how defensible are these solutions when, someone can, whatever, throw it in base 44 or cursor and maybe they'll do it themselves. Kind of silly, I know, a bit of a straw man argument, but what do you think is the net effect of what we're seeing in AI right now for your business and for, vertical SMB solutions in general?
Yeah. I think it's incredibly interesting, exciting, and opportunistic of how you can help your vertical use AI to help achieve or accomplish the things that they might not have been able to do before. And I say to my team all the time, I don't know who else has 50 engineers and data people and product people, 50 plus, that are focused on how to take all these AI or LLMs or new kind of APIs or solutions and applying it to youth sports. So we should be great and innovative on how to apply all kinds of new technology to youth sport. And they don't want to yes, AI is always like, cool to say, but they don't want to hear AI. They want to hear a new approach to solving a problem, And some of the first simplest things we're doing is like, we've sent out millions of emails. You have a rainout coming out, let that, give them 3 different emails of, a rainout's coming, but I want to cheer everyone up. Can you create this for me? Instead of them having to figure out how to write an email to their club about a rainout, right? So it's simple things like that. How should I charge for this program? Give them a bunch of ways to understand where they want to, be at the top of the market or be affordable, or different ways that they could do that, or how to allocate their field space in the most, whether it's economical way or the most, mass participation way, or how to schedule 40 games where, coaches are overlapping and there's only a certain amount of refs. That's the solutions that they want. And it's on us to make AI utilize that to give them those solutions. So,
assuming it's better than current state. Yeah.
And totally. On my grumpier days, I'm like, man, I'm 15 years doing this and I still haven't figured out like double elimination tournament brackets when, there's a rain out and 2 refs don't show. Right. And I'm like, well, why am I still building that? And I think AI will allow us to kind of really get not just workflows, but tie the workflows with like insight and intelligence. And again, be employee 3, 4, and 5 for a youth sports organization. And if you're employee 3, 4, and 5 for a youth sports organization, they could run more events and have more activities and provide a better experience and do better being on the field and do better reaching out to parents. I want to solve the sports operators. It's funny. It's the one industry where you just don't want anything to do with your customers, because the customers are parents. No one likes the parents. The parents are overzealous. The parents are impossible to deal with and irrational, right? How can we solve? I never thought we would be able to solve the parent dilemma for youth sports operators. I think we can, right? We could build tools that make it so easy. Is that a super service where we're just like, we'll take on all your, like, we're trying to figure this out. Will we take on all your customer support? Will we just give you, better tools so that you could have, bots that do it for you?
Betsy, the parent AI agent that deals with all the parents.
Yeah. That's the type of stuff that, I'm pumped up to bring to market.
That's cool. Tell us a little bit, and this will be my last question, and then Nick, you can round this out, but tell us a little bit about the XL-KKR round that you guys just announced recently.
Yes. So, we had 60 different investors over 15 years from, early stage friends and families to early stage VC funds, right? And we had some really cool investors, Major League Baseball and Elysian Park, which is the Los Angeles Dodgers. So we had this collection of investors, and most of them were super supportive. But we were getting to a size and stage where we were more of a mature business. We got to profitability, coming out of, the whole cycle in 22, 23. And it was really the first time we learned about, what is growth capital and what is private equity and what is this asset class. And the more we learned, the more we saw, wow, there's a lot of resources. There's a lot of capital. There's a lot of ways that they take companies from X to Y, and they're pretty disciplined about it. And we recognize that can be a good next stage of LeagueApps. It could provide the, liquidity of solutions for a lot of our early investors, a lot of our early employees. So it seemed like it would be best for the company, which as a founder, I was like, we have to start with that. It would be really great for all of our investors who have been super, loyal and patient. It would be great for the next, investor who saw the value of what we were building. And we were able for that all to come together last year and allowed many of our investors that wanted to continue to roll, and brought in actually a few new investors. Arctos, which is a sports fund that has ownership in probably a few dozen teams by now, is super helpful. And I think it's in many ways like reinvigorated the energy and the life of the next phase of LeagueApps. So learning a lot around what it means to be a private equity backed company, and the partners that we have in XL-KKR have been really great partners to us in appreciating our values and our mission, and then bringing a lot of rigor and heft in places where they're super strong at, and they have a really good playbook. And they love vertical SaaS as much as you guys do. They just do it at a different stage. And they geek out on finding software companies in markets that you just would never expect. And it's been pretty fun to learn about like some of these, sometimes 20, 30-year-old software companies that never even came close to, raising venture, but have built pretty significant and massive businesses. So in terms of vertical SaaS and payments, that's.
What was the weirdest vertical SaaS payment or company you saw in the portfolio? And weird's a bad word, but like,
where I see a lot where it's like supply chain logistics for manufacturing in South America for accounts payable, and you're like, I can't, but it's not.
And it's printing.
I don't even know what you're talking about, but they're really pumped up about Rule of 40 and all these metrics. Sometimes they're markets where there's only a few players in the market, right? At the end of the day, youth sports is like a passion space where everyone will be creating companies, but there's a lot of SaaS spaces where no one will create companies because they don't even know that thing needs software, right? And which is really cool because you hear these stories, and it has nothing to do with like, oh, I raised venture in a segment where it's like I had this problem for 20 years when I was running this other business, and now built software around it. And most of them never did it to, 20 years later, do a private equity deal. But you see their businesses, and some of the EBITDA margin, the growth is really phenomenal. And the stories behind it are also phenomenal.
That's awesome. Well, Nick, round us out here with the final question for Mr. Litvack.
Absolutely. Well, I can't, Brian, not take that bait. What do you think is the next great Hyper-SMB market? Or just one you really maybe came across that you like? Talked about kind of some of the weirder PE-backed ones, but like if you were starting again fresh, any you would target?
The thing I can't figure out as a homeowner is I'm so bad and everything's so hard. and there's always like 5 things in my house that don't work. And I'm horrible at like, following up and scheduling all these different vendors. So I know that there's a lot of platforms, and I love the pro cars and Service Titans and all these things. But I don't think anyone is looking, no one seems at scale at the homeowner and saying, here's the tool that you need to give you your time back and give you safety and quality, that the things in your home will work, whether it's your, AC or plumbing or Terminator or Exterminator or, pool or hot tub, in a centralized way. Usually there's all these one-off things. So I deal with this problem every freaking day. I get home from work, right? I take the train back to Long Island, and the first thing in my house, I'm either reminded or see something that's not working. And it seems like so much work to figure out how to fix it.
Yep.
I like it.
And that's one where I think people are like, well, that's not a SaaS business. That's a consumer business, because, people own their homes. Well, you start to look at the math and you're like, okay, what could a person pay, and what are they paying already now, and how would the math work? And,
AI first thumbtack coming your way.
Well, I'm always on Thumbtack, and that thing is like, that's a marketplace. It's a marketplace, right? It's not
You need like a membership based tool. Yeah. No, that's cool. Well, thanks, Brian. We really appreciate it, man. It means a lot to Nick and I for you taking some time, and definitely to the vertical SaaS community. You built a really, really cool business, and excited to see where you take it next. Sky's the limit here. It feels like it's a much bigger market than people think it is, and people still think it's big. It's pretty enormous. So I'm stoked for you, man, and kudos on all you've done.
Congrats, man.
Thanks, Brian.
Well, that's a wrap for today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us once again. It was awesome to have on Brian Litvack of LeagueApps. Incredible business. Hope you learned as much as we did from this episode. We are, going to be back on next week as usual. We are welcoming Jack Greco, co-founder of ACV Auctions. That will be another incredible story, and I bet a killer guest. So I hope you guys can tune in and join us next week and every week to come. We also want to give, as always, a big shout out to Paraffin. Paraffin has made this entire podcast possible. If you are not familiar with Paraffin, they provide ready to launch financial products that help your merchants grow. If you're a vertical software business, vertical software founder, as I imagine many of you are, and you haven't come to understand Paraffin and what they do, highly suggest that you check them out. As you think about embedded capital, embedded spend, just basically ways to drive additional revenue retention, as we were talking about today, find TAM expansion on top of your existing offerings. Paraffin is one to check out for sure. So incredibly thankful to them for partnering with Luke and I on building verticals. And, incredibly thankful to you for joining us. So thanks again, and we'll see you next week.